fog rolled down the Appalachian mountains like something alive, creeping over the broken fence posts and swallowing the dirt road leading into the abandoned Miller property. The place hadn't seen a living soul in decades, at least not one that stayed long enough to speak afterward. But when Luke Miller stepped out of his truck and shut the door behind him, the mountains seemed to exhale, as if recognizing a bloodline that never should have returned. The air felt wrong instantly. Heavy. Thick. Too quiet for a place that had once been home to children's laughter and Sunday porch songs. Luke had grown up far from these mountains, raised on stories his father muttered only during drink-softened nights, stories of a family that carried darkness in its bones. But those were just tales, he had told himself. Something old men say when they're trying to bury guilt. Yet the letter he received last month unsigned, smelling faintly of cedar and mold, said otherwise. Come home. Before the woods decide for you. He tried to shake it off, crunching through the overgrown path that once passed for a yard. But the woods watched him. He could feel it. Every branch hung too still, every shadow too deep, as though the forest were holding its breath. Somewhere far off, a sound echoed, soft, almost like someone calling his name. He froze. The voice was familiar in a way that turned his stomach cold. It sounded like his father. Except his father had been dead for 9 years. Luke forced himself forward, but the unease crawled alongside him, whispering up his spine. The house appeared through the fog, rotting but standing, its windows dark like empty eye sockets. Something about it felt expectant. A home remembering a child returning after far too long. A home waiting to remind him why their bloodline never lasted past middle age, why every Miller ended up lost, broken, or mad. He had come looking for the truth, a history scrubbed clean by silence and fear. But as the wind shifted and the trees groaned like they were waking from a long sleep, Luke realized something he should have understood the moment he stepped out of the truck. The unearthed journal first appears in the story as an almost accidental discovery, yet nothing about it feels accidental to the one who finds it. A lone hiker, wandering off marked trails in search of a shortcut down the ridge, notices something unusual at the base of an old hemlock, its roots twisted unnaturally upward, as though the tree had tried to reject something buried beneath it. The hiker initially assumes it is just another piece of litter left behind by careless campers, but the moment he pulls the mud-soaked object free, a chill settles over the forest. The journal is small, bound in leather that has gone soft with age and moisture, and secured with a strap broken long ago. It feels unnervingly warm in his hands despite the cold mountain air. The hiker flips it open expecting blank pages or ruined ink, but the entries inside remain disturbingly intact, as if someone had written them recently rather than decades ago. Thick, frantic handwriting fills every page. Much of it is smeared, but certain phrases stand out with startling clarity: warnings about the woods waking up, careful sketches of distorted human faces stretched too long, and repeated references to a family cursed by its own blood. The deeper he reads, the more he senses that the journal was never meant to be found, that the forest had been hiding it for a reason. Every illustration seems to pulse with a strange, frantic energy, especially a page near the middle where a detailed drawing of a house sits beneath a canopy of claw-like branches. The windows of the house are filled with staring eyes, and beneath the sketch is a single line, asterisk if they return, it begins again. Asterisk. As he continues, he notices that the entries shift from fearful observations to full-blown panic, as the writer describes hearing voices calling from the trees, voices that sounded like lost relatives begging to be let in. There are notes about shadow figures mimicking familiar footsteps, about nights where the woods seemed to crawl closer, reshaping themselves around the family home. The writer insists that something in the forest demands lineage, that the land remembers blood even when the people try to forget. The hiker feels the weight of the journal growing heavier as he reads, as if the object itself resents being exposed to daylight. A sudden rustling in the trees jolts him from the final pages, which end abruptly with a warning scrawled in shaky ink, telling anyone who finds it to leave the mountains immediately. For the first time, he realizes that the forest around him has gone silent, so quiet that even his own breath feels too loud, and he senses that by picking up the journal he has disturbed more than simple earth. The bloodline returns when a man named Luke, completely unaware of his family's dark legacy, is drawn back to the mountains by a letter that should never have reached him. The envelope is yellowed, its ink faded and smudged, as though it had been rewritten or carried through the elements for years before finally arriving in his hands. It contains only a few cryptic lines urging him to come home, though he never considered these mountains his home. He grew up far away, raised by a father who refused to speak of his childhood except in vague, haunted fragments. Luke had always assumed the silence was rooted in poverty or shame, not in terror. Yet the more he studies the letter, the shaky handwriting, the strange symbols near the signature, the more he feels the tug of something familiar beneath the surface, something that whispers this message was meant for him alone. The timing is unsettling. His father has been dead for nearly a decade, and no other living relatives have ever reached out. The return address is nothing more than the name of a road he's never heard of, a road lined with woods his father once warned him never to enter. Despite every instinct telling him to ignore it, Luke feels a pull he can't quite explain, as if something buried in his blood responds to the message with a faint, unwanted recognition. He convinces himself it's just curiosity, or the need to confront whatever traumas his father carried into adulthood, but deep inside he senses the truth. The letter is not an invitation but a summons. Upon arriving in the abandoned mountain town, he feels watched the moment his tires crunch onto the gravel road. The houses stand like wooden skeletons, hollowed out and leaning, but even in their decay they seem to be studying him. Locals who still remain in the area glance his way with quick, uneasy looks before turning sharply and disappearing inside. When he asks for directions to the old family property, conversations die mid-sentence. Some people mutter prayers under their breath. Others simply stare at him as though he has brought something dangerous back into their lives. Luke tries to brush off their reactions, telling himself they are just suspicious of outsiders, but a deeper part of him knows they recognize him. Not him personally, but his resemblance to the men whose portraits once hung in his father's attic. The bloodline is unmistakable. As he moves closer to the edge of the woods, the mountains seem to shift, their silence thickening around him. He doesn't realize it yet, but his very presence has awakened something dormant in the land, something that has been waiting for the return of a Miller descendant, because the curse that clung to his ancestors never truly ended. It simply waited for the next member of the bloodline to step back onto the soil that remembers every secret they tried to bury. The locals' silence becomes one of the first true warnings Luke encounters, though he doesn't understand the weight of it at first. When he drives into the town, a cluster of crumbling storefronts, shuttered homes, and a gas station that looks held together by rust and memory, he expects at least some form of small-town hospitality. Instead, every conversation seems to wither the moment he introduces himself. The man at the gas station, who initially greets him with the bored politeness of someone who rarely sees travelers, stiffens immediately when Luke mentions his last name. His eyes dart toward the tree line as if expecting something to emerge from it. Without another word, he rings up the purchase and offers no directions, despite Luke's obvious confusion about the roads ahead. When Luke steps outside, he notices an older woman sweeping her porch across the street. She had been humming softly before he approached, but the moment he tries to ask whether she knows where the Miller property is located, her broom freezes mid-air. Her lips press tightly together, her eyes flick to the mountains behind him, and she silently retreats inside, slamming the door with a sharp finality. Luke tells himself she might be senile or simply unfriendly, but the same pattern continues as he meets others. A pair of teenagers loitering near the old bait shop whisper to each other the moment he walks past. One of them makes the sign of the cross. Another spits on the ground as though to ward off something evil. The deeper he moves into town, the more noticeable the reactions become. People turn away quickly, avoiding his gaze with almost aggressive determination. A butcher refuses to answer a simple question about the roads leading west. A farmer hauling feed bags won't even acknowledge his presence. Even the stray dog curled beneath a bench growls low when he steps too close. Every interaction carries a thick undercurrent of fear, but it isn't fear of him, at least not him as a person. It is the recognition of the name he carries, the curse tied to the land he has unknowingly returned to. Luke begins to notice how the locals speak around him rather than to him. Conversations shift when he is nearby, voices lower, shoulders tense, eyes drift toward the woods that border the town like a waiting predator. Some mutter snippets he can't fully catch, phrases like should have stayed gone, same eyes, and the woods always remember. A few speak his family name only in whispers, as if saying it too loudly might summon something listening in the treetops. Though no one explains the truth directly, their silence becomes more revealing than any explanation. It is the silence of people who have heard the same story repeated too many times, seen the same horrors return in different generations, and know better than to involve themselves. Luke realizes the town isn't just indifferent, it is terrified. Not of the curse itself, but of the moment a miller sets foot in the mountains again, because that moment has always marked the beginning of something dreadful, something the locals have spent years praying would never resurface. Whispers in the trees begin subtly, almost deceptively, as Luke navigates the dense forest that borders the old Miller property. At first, he thinks it's the wind threading through the pine needles, a trick of the branches scraping together, or perhaps the distant chatter of birds settling in for the evening. But the sounds persist, growing too deliberate to dismiss. They start as indistinct murmurs, faint syllables that seem to ride the cool night air, curling around the trunks and slipping under the brush. Luke stops and strains to listen, heart quickening, yet the forest offers no clarity, only repetition, the soft, melodic cadence of a voice calling his name. It is eerily familiar, echoing a tone he knows from childhood, a warmth that once belonged to his father but now carries a hollow, distorted resonance that chills him to the bone. Each night that he ventures deeper into the woods, the whispers grow bolder. They no longer hide behind the leaves, they circle him, moving in ways that defy natural acoustics, coming from all directions at once. Sometimes they mimic fragments of past conversations he had with his father, recalling warnings he thought long forgotten, but twisted with a sense of menace, as if the forest itself were learning his memories and reshaping them. Luke begins to feel the weight of eyes upon him, though every glance reveals nothing. He catches only shadows, fleeting glimpses at the periphery, and the whispering intensifies whenever he acknowledges their presence, growing more insistent, more demanding. Sleep offers no relief. At night, the whispers penetrate the walls of the cabin where he takes refuge. Even behind locked doors, the voices seep through cracks, calling with varying inflections that confuse his mind. He dreams of figures standing at the edge of the woods, mouthless and reaching, while the voices call not just his name but the names of ancestors he has never met, names he feels bound to in ways he cannot explain. Each utterance of the names carries a weight, a pull that drags at his consciousness, urging him toward the forest, toward the heart of the property, toward something he cannot see but instinctively knows is waiting. Luke attempts to ignore the sounds, telling himself they are tricks of the wind or his imagination, a combination of loneliness and old stories haunting his mind. Yet the forest adapts. It shifts subtly with each step he takes, pathways he once thought familiar twisting and elongating, always keeping him within earshot of the whispers. It becomes increasingly clear that these are not mere echoes but intentional communications, a bridge between him and something ancient, something that has observed the Miller bloodline for generations, waiting for the moment a descendant would finally return. Each night the voices grow stronger, and Luke begins to realize that the forest does not just contain the whispers, it is alive with them, alive with memories, and that memory remembers him. The first embodiment appears on a night so dark that the moon hides behind thick clouds, leaving the woods around Luke's cabin bathed in near-total blackness. He had been pacing inside, trying to make sense of the whispers that had followed him deeper into the mountains, when a sudden movement outside the window catches his eye. At first, he assumes it is a deer or some other nocturnal animal, but the figure doesn't move with natural grace. Its silhouette is humanoid, but twisted in subtle, impossible ways. The head tilts at an unnatural angle, the limbs bend slightly too far, and the weight of its presence presses against the glass as if testing the barrier between the cabin and the world beyond. Luke freezes, his breath catching, unable to tear his gaze away, and the air around him grows colder, heavier, as though the figure draws warmth and life from its surroundings. Then it speaks. Or rather, it imitates. The voice is familiar, frighteningly so, an exact echo of his father's tone, the cadence of words he hasn't heard in nearly a decade. The figure murmurs his name, mimicking gestures Luke recognizes from childhood, a hand raised in warning, a subtle nod, a movement meant to soothe yet twisted into menace. Every motion feels rehearsed, studied, as if the figure has observed his family for generations and now performs them with precision meant to unnerve. Luke wants to look away, to retreat into the safety of his cabin, but he can't. Something in the figure holds him, demands acknowledgement, and each heartbeat seems louder, more exposed in the unnatural stillness of the night. The air thickens, and shadows around the cabin stretch and pulse unnaturally, as if responding to the presence of the figure. The imitation is not perfect, there is something wrong in its eyes, a darkness that absorbs light instead of reflecting it, a hollowness where familiarity should exist. Yet the mimicry is enough to make Luke question his own perception, to doubt the solidity of the world around him. For a moment, the figure steps closer, pressing against the window so that Luke sees not just its shadow but the faint distortion of a face, familiar yet grotesque, features exaggerated in ways that make him recoil. It smiles, or at least, it bends its lips into something resembling a smile, and the sound of his father's voice comes again, repeating fragments of warnings and admonishments Luke barely remembers. As the night stretches on, the figure does not retreat. It lingers just beyond the glass, a living echo of the past yet impossibly warped by some ancient, malevolent memory. It does not merely scare him, it embodies the cumulative fear of generations, a tangible manifestation of the curse that clings to the Miller bloodline. Luke realizes, with a sinking certainty, that this is only the beginning, that the horrors of his ancestors are not trapped in history but have been waiting, patient, for a descendant to return, and that the figure outside the window is the first undeniable proof that the past is reaching out to claim him. The ancestral pact is revealed slowly, like a shadow emerging from the forest, creeping into Luke's consciousness as he explores deeper into the mountains surrounding the Miller property. It begins with a series of strange markers he discovers while following the twisted trails behind the cabin, piles of stones arranged in geometric patterns, charred remnants of candles, and symbols carved crudely into tree trunks. Each mark seems deliberate, intentional, a language he does not yet understand but feels viscerally connected to. The more he observes, the more he notices that these markings are not random, they correspond with the descriptions in the journal he had found, the same symbols, the same ritual sites, the same warnings about the family's bloodline. A creeping dread settles over him as he begins to understand that his ancestors had not merely lived here, they had bargained with something far older, far more insidious than he can comprehend, and that pact is still active, still alive in these woods. Luke's first encounter with the site is subtle, almost understated. Hidden beneath a tangle of roots and fallen leaves, he discovers a shallow depression in the earth, ringed with stones blackened from fire long extinguished. At the center is a carved symbol he recognizes immediately from the journal, an interlocking pattern of lines that seems to shimmer faintly in the fading light. He traces it with his finger, and a sudden chill courses through him, as though the forest itself has inhaled. The wind rises, carrying with it a whisper of voices, chanting or perhaps warning in a language he doesn't understand. The trees sway unnaturally, bending as though alive, and Luke feels a pressure in his chest, a pull toward the center of the stone circle that he cannot resist. In that moment, he understands the enormity of what his family had done generations ago. They traded their sanity, their freedom, their very essence, to bind a force to their blood, to ensure protection and survival at a cost they could never have fully imagined. As he studies the site further, fragments of the past reveal themselves. He sees faint impressions in the soil, like shadows of people kneeling in reverence, and he hears faint echoes of promises made in desperation, pledges to the forest, to the earth, to something ancient and patient. Every instinct tells him to flee, but curiosity chains him in place. He realizes that the pact is not just historical, it is living, and by returning to the land, he has reawakened it. The whispers around him intensify, and the forest seems to lean closer, watching, waiting for acknowledgement. Luke begins to grasp that his ancestors had attempted to control the uncontrollable, to manipulate a power beyond their understanding, and that their bargain continues to demand obedience. The weight of their choices presses upon him, and he understands that the curse tied to his bloodline is not merely superstition, it is a contract, one that waits for each generation to step back onto the mountains and either fulfill it or succumb to the consequences that will inevitably follow. History repeats itself as Luke begins to notice that the events around him mirror the dark stories recorded in the journal he had uncovered. At first, the parallels are subtle. A broken fence along the edge of the property that collapses in the same pattern described decades ago, the same eerie sound of branches scraping across the cabin windows on stormy nights, even the same patterns of footprints in the mud outside that seem to appear and vanish without explanation. Each detail is uncanny, almost impossible, yet undeniable. It is as if time itself is folding in on the land, replaying the tragedies and terrors of the past, and Luke is caught in the center of a cycle that his ancestors could never break. The forest does not merely remember, it enacts, replaying events like a twisted shadow of memory, forcing the present to collide with the past in ways that blur reality. As he moves through the property, he begins seeing echoes of the family's prior misfortunes. Objects are displaced in ways he does not remember arranging, doors open and close with an unnatural rhythm, and the cabin's walls creak in patterns that suggest whispered arguments long past. At times, he hears laughter of children playing, children who never existed in his own memory but whose presence is recorded in the journal, recounting moments of joy abruptly ended by fear and tragedy. Shadows appear where they should not, mimicking the forms of people long dead, performing motions that make him shiver because they seem at once familiar and alien. He recognizes gestures that were once his father's, or his grandfather's, and realizes the echoes are not random, they are reenactments, as if the land itself insists that history be repeated until someone breaks the pattern. One evening, Luke witnesses a shadowy figure at the edge of the woods, moving with deliberate steps that mirror the actions described in a particularly violent passage from the journal. The figure strikes a tree, causing bark to splinter in a way identical to an account of an ancestor's outburst. Luke freezes, realizing that the journal was not simply a record of events but a blueprint, and he is now living through its reenactment. Panic sets in as he notices that each night, the forest grows more active, orchestrating movements, sounds, and presences that mimic past horrors. Even the wind carries faint voices, repeating cries for help, warnings, and curses once uttered generations ago. He begins to understand that the curse is not a single event but a pattern, a cyclical unfolding of violence, fear, and madness that cannot be ignored. Every action he takes, every choice to stay or flee, is measured against this history, as though the mountains themselves are testing him. The more he resists, the more insistently the forest recreates what came before, forcing him to confront the same fears, the same terror, and the same inevitability that claimed the lives and sanity of his ancestors. The repetition is suffocating, relentless, and unmistakable, and Luke realizes that the past is not past at all, it is alive, reshaping the present into a mirror of old nightmares, and that he may be powerless to stop it. The last living relative emerges almost like a ghost from the mountains, an elderly hermit who seems to have grown out of the woods themselves. Luke first notices him perched on a jagged outcrop overlooking the valley, hunched and wrapped in tattered layers, a figure both frail and impossibly alert. At first, the man's presence feels incidental, just another recluse in a town that has long since emptied of the young and bold. But when Luke approaches, the hermit's eyes lock onto him with an intensity that stops his breath. They are eyes that have witnessed decades of sorrow and terror, eyes that recognize Luke instantly not just as a stranger, but as the inheritor of a burden carried for generations. There is a weight in the silence that falls between them, a knowledge unspoken yet immediately understood. The curse that has haunted the Miller bloodline is real, and its consequences are still very much alive. The hermit speaks in a low, rasping voice, barely above the sound of the wind threading through the pines. He begins to recount fragments of history, stories Luke had never heard and that were never written in the journal. He tells of ancestors who attempted to defy the pact, only to vanish mysteriously, their fates sealed by the forest itself. Each tale is punctuated with long pauses, as if the mountains themselves demand respect and remembrance of what they have seen. The hermit explains that the curse awakens whenever a surviving member of the bloodline returns to the land, that the mountains remember their names, their actions, their failures, and that they do not forgive or forget. Every generation, he says, is tested, and the forest ensures that the cycle continues unless someone takes responsibility, someone chooses to confront the ancient forces instead of fleeing from them. Luke listens, the enormity of the revelation pressing down on him. He begins to notice patterns he had missed, how the whispers in the trees always start when he crosses the threshold of the property, how shadows mimic movements from long-dead relatives, and how every unsettling occurrence mirrors a story the hermit now confirms. The hermit's presence is more than guidance, it is a reminder that the curse is not abstract, not folklore, it is a tangible, living force, patient and calculating, and Luke's arrival has rekindled its hunger. The mountains themselves seem to lean closer as the hermit speaks, as though the forest approves of the lesson being delivered, ensuring that Luke understands the stakes. By the time the sun dips below the ridges and the sky darkens to bruised purples and blacks, Luke realizes that this encounter is not casual. The hermit is the final living witness, the keeper of truths that can no longer be ignored. He knows the forest, the curse, and the ways the bloodline has faltered. He alone can guide Luke toward the choices he must make, though those choices are grim, to embrace the burden and confront the curse, or to ignore it and risk becoming another echo in the mountains, lost to the same darkness that claimed so many of his ancestors before him. The forest waits. The mountains remember. The woods come alive in a way Luke had never imagined, transforming from silent sentinels into something sentient, watching, and relentless. At first, the changes are subtle. The underbrush seems to shift when he looks away, roots curling and twisting as though they have a life of their own, branches bending unnaturally to block paths he had traversed the day before. The forest no longer feels like a backdrop to his exploration but a participant, a predator aware of his presence and intent on testing him. Each step he takes seems measured against an unseen rhythm, and every noise, the snap of twigs, the rustle of leaves, is amplified, echoing with intent. Luke senses that the woods themselves remember the blood of his ancestors, that they have been lying in wait for generations, watching, learning, and preparing for the return of a miller. As the sun dips below the mountains, shadows stretch impossibly long, intertwining with the trees, crawling toward him with a subtle, malevolent consciousness. Strange sounds follow him, soft whispers that mimic familiar voices, the distant laughter of children long dead, and the clatter of something moving just beyond sight. He feels fingers of air brush against his skin, yet no wind stirs, and the ground beneath his feet seems to shift, subtly tilting to force him toward certain paths and away from others. At times, he glimpses shapes moving between the trees, elongated, distorted figures that vanish when looked at directly, leaving only a lingering sense of being watched, of something calculating each movement he makes. The forest is no longer neutral, it is orchestrated, alive with the memory of every pact, every curse, every moment of fear and violence his ancestors endured. The wildlife reacts unnaturally to his presence. Birds fall silent when he approaches, small animals scurry away in sudden, coordinated bursts, and even the wind carries a scent that is not entirely natural, smoky, earthy, metallic. Every instinct tells him to flee, yet he finds himself drawn further in, compelled by forces older than memory, as though the land itself demands acknowledgement of his lineage. The forest presses closer around him at night, the trees leaning, shadows elongating, creating tunnels that guide him deeper, where the previous generations left reminders and warnings. Branches scrape against windows and doors with an almost deliberate rhythm, repeating motions from events long past, signaling the presence of something that can see beyond the physical, tracking him not merely in space but in inheritance. Luke realizes with growing terror that the curse is not just a story, not a collection of tales, it is a living entity intertwined with the land, an intelligence that has waited patiently for a descendant to return. The mountains themselves breathe, exhaling the memories and terrors of the Miller bloodline, ensuring that nothing remains dormant for long. Every step forward confirms that the woods are no longer passive, they are active participants, shaping reality around him, manifesting nightmares that his ancestors endured, and preparing to test whether he can endure them too. The forest watches, and it remembers, and Luke is beginning to understand that he is no longer merely walking through it, he is walking into it, and it is walking back. The final choice looms over Luke like the oppressive shadow of the mountains themselves, a decision that carries consequences far beyond his own survival. After nights spent listening to the whispers, dodging the grotesque figures that mimic his family, and feeling the forest pulse with a consciousness that is both patient and hungry, he begins to understand the true weight of the curse. It is not merely a series of misfortunes that have haunted the Millers for generations, it is a living, demanding entity that tests each descendant, shaping reality to force confrontation with the legacy they inherit. The woods themselves, the very soil under his feet, seem to tremble with expectation, as if aware that the moment for reckoning has arrived. Every shadow, every rustle of leaves, every fragmented echo of the past is a reminder that avoidance is no longer possible and that the cost of failure is measured not only in his suffering but in the potential for the curse to spread beyond the mountains. Luke understands that the curse offers two paths, neither of them easy or safe. One path is to surrender himself, to accept the forest's dominion and offer himself as a vessel to its hunger, a final act that might contain the darkness and prevent it from consuming the town, the valley, and perhaps the wider world. It is a path that promises death, but in that death lies purpose, a sealing of the pact, an acknowledgement of the ancestral debt that has haunted his bloodline. The other path, far more tempting yet infinitely more dangerous, is to resist, to try to escape the mountains and refuse the role imposed upon him. But Luke feels the pull of inevitability in every whispered warning and every shadowed figure. The forest will not relinquish its claim easily. To flee is to gamble with the lives of those beyond these peaks, to risk allowing the nightmares that have waited for generations to spill into the wider world, infecting others with the same terror and madness that has plagued his ancestors. As he stands in the center of the ritual site, the stones blackened from centuries of fire, the forest encircling him like a living wall, Luke feels the oppressive pressure of time and blood. The winds howl through the trees with voices that sound like his father, his grandfather, and countless unrecorded millers, all urging him to act, to decide, to acknowledge the power that waits. Every instinct screams to survive, to turn away, to run from the darkness that has hunted his family for centuries. Yet another part of him, a part that understands the patterns of history, knows that survival alone is meaningless unless he confronts the ancient debt. The choice crystallizes in the cold night air, to give himself to the forest, to embrace the curse and end its cycle, or to defy it, risking the extension of centuries of suffering into new generations, spreading the nightmares that have been held at bay only by the patience and terror of his ancestors. The forest waits, patient and eternal, and Luke realizes that his decision will not only determine his fate but define the legacy of the Miller bloodline forever.